Most people only understand this too late. Life never promised to be good. Not for you, not for anyone. You are born without asking. You grow up surrounded by invisible demands, and you spend your youth convinced that something is waiting for you. A happiness, a recognition, a reason. But time passes, and what you invariably find is a world that does not care about you. By 30, you already know someone who died young. By 40, you have already seen marriages fall apart without drama, just from exhaustion. By 50, you have already understood that health is a roulette wheel and that the body, even well cared for, has an expiration date. The promise of life is not fullness, it is wear and tear. This is the wound that Schopenhauer had the courage to open. While others philosophized about virtues, meanings, and essences, he confronted the question everyone avoids. What if pain were not an error, but the structure of the real? In his eyes, suffering is not the exception. It is the gear, the force that moves everything, from a baby crying for milk to a living being obsessed with goals. A blind, impersonal, and cruelly persistent impulse that he called will. And if you are tired, frustrated, or broken, it is not because you have failed, it is because you are alive. How to resist this without resorting to denial, escapism, or self-deception. This is where Schopenhauer offers us something rare, an existential map without any lies. But be warned, following this path requires courage. Not to change the world, but to renounce illusory certainties. That is what this video is about. Not how to be happy, but how to suffer less. Because perhaps, in the end, that is all we have. You can cut your hair, change cities, change partners, change your life. And yet, something keeps burning inside. A silent, almost animal restlessness. A nameless will. You do not know what you want. You just know that what you have is not enough. This is the truth no one wants to face. We do not have desires. We are desires. And we are not the ones commanding them. Arthur Schopenhauer did not philosophize to please. He opened the chest of existence with a philosophical scalpel and exposed the wound. Behind all rationality, all love, all ambition, there is a blind, unconscious, automatic impulse. He called it will, but not a noble, conscious, or elevated will. No, the will, for Schopenhauer, is a brutal, irrational, incessant force. A cosmic principle that manifests itself in all forms of life. From a worm to the emperor. It has no plan, no purpose. It does not seek good. It wants to keep wanting. That is all. The will is what makes the lion hunt, the plant grow, the man lie, marry, work, hate, buy, procreate, and kill. Everything, according to him, is a disguise for the same mechanism. Life trying to reproduce itself at any cost and without any final justification. The will is the inner nature of the world and man's own self, wrote Arthur Schopenhauer. And that is why we suffer, because this force in us never ceases. We desire, we conquer, we lose interest, we desire again. A perfect cycle of dissatisfaction, satisfaction. And what makes us human, our intelligence, consciousness, and language only aggravates it. Because now, besides wanting, we know that we want. And we know that what we want will never be enough. Look closely. An animal suffers from physical pain. A human being suffers from boredom, from anguish, from expectation. The lion calms down after the hunt. The man never does. The philosopher was not deceived. All satisfaction is essentially merely negative. It only removes the pain of desire. But as soon as it ceases, desire is reborn. That is, there is no pure pleasure, only pauses in pain. What you call happiness is just an interval, and behind this realization there is a brutal consequence. If the will is in everything, then suffering is also in everything. Not because the world is cruel, but because it is indifferent, blindly active, without any ethics behind it. This idea destroys the superficial optimism of so many philosophical and religious currents that believe in progress, constant improvement, or divine purposes. There is no progress, there is no promise. There is only repetition of suffering with small aesthetic variations, hence the most beautiful phrase in pessimistic philosophy. Life oscillates like a pendulum between boredom and pain, and there is no emotional escape from this truth. Any attempt to soften it, whether with blind faith, consumption, or distraction, is just temporary anesthesia. We are not lost because the world is cruel. We are lost because it feels nothing. That is the foundation of pain. Not the lack of meaning, but the excess of wanting. Schopenhauer does not insult us with light advice. He proposes something deeper. If we want to understand suffering, we need to stop looking at what we lack and start understanding why we desire so much. Only then can we, little by little, diminish the force that this will has over us. The pursuit of happiness is, perhaps, the most tragic of human comedies, because the more we believe it is possible, the crueler its absence becomes. What if the biggest mistake of our species was to have made happiness a goal? If, as Schopenhauer says, we are not made to be happy, but only to continue existing despite the pain, then all pursuit of happiness would be, deep down, a misreading of reality itself. Here is the paradox. The more you chase pleasure as an end in itself, the further you get from it. The reason is simple. Pleasure has no substance. It only appears as a relief from tension, as a temporary suspension of pain. Arthur Schopenhauer wrote, "All positive happiness is essentially impossible. What we call happiness consists only in the decrease of pain." This statement is not just rhetoric. It dismantles the foundation of modern ethics, which confuses well-being with purpose. The Enlightenment idea that the world is moving toward moral, material, and emotional progress is, for Schopenhauer, an illusion generated by the will to justify its own repetition. Does comfort increase?
Yes. Does medicine advance?
Yes. And anguish? It grows just the same. Modern boredom is no less torturous than the medieval plague. It is just quieter. Happiness, in this context, becomes a fetish, something constantly promised, rarely delivered, and always at the cost of more effort, more comparison, more desire. It is at this point that the critique becomes devastating, because if we believe we should be happy, then all absence of happiness begins to be seen as personal failure. You are not sad. You are failing at being happy. And it is in this diagnosis that the suffering industry is fed. Empty therapies, motivational gurus, success formulas. Schopenhauer anticipates this with brutal accuracy. The greatest illusion in life is to expect from the outside what can only come from inner renunciation. That is, we do not suffer because life is difficult. We suffer because we were taught that it should be easy. This is the poison. The belief in continuous happiness as a right, as a destiny, as a goal, puts the human being in permanent war with reality. And there is no greater source of anguish than that. Believing that everything is wrong, simply because not everything is right. It is at this point that Schopenhauer's philosophy reveals its therapeutic coldness. It does not promise an exit. It cuts the root of suffering not by offering relief, but by lucid disillusionment. Happiness ceases to be a goal and becomes something closer to an accident, a truce, an interval between pains. And this is where any rational objection collapses, because it does not matter how much wealth, prestige, or pleasure someone accumulates. None of that has ever guaranteed lasting contentment. The world is full of examples. People at the top of the social hierarchy, living in mansions with pools, abandon life with notes saying, "I cannot take it anymore." How to explain this, if not by the breakdown of the very idea of happiness? The mistake is not in not being happy. It is in believing that we should be. The fate of most is to oscillate between suffering and boredom. If this phrase seems cruel, it is because we live immersed in the opposite lie, that happiness is the standard, and any deviation from that is illness, imbalance, or fault. No, continuous happiness is not real. Suffering is. And only when we abandon the expectation of happiness as a right can we begin to organize a life that is not systematically disappointing. It is not an invitation to sadness. It is a liberation from the lie. We want freedom, but we live enslaved by what we desire. We want peace, but we continue to feed everything that agitates us. We live in contradiction, and the most perverse thing is that no one forces us. We are the ones tightening our own shackles, hoping that one day they will lead us to happiness. Schopenhauer observed this silent tragedy with clinical coldness. For him, there were two extreme paths that promise liberation, but both fail for most people. On one hand, asceticism, total renunciation, the rejection of the flesh, the mortification of the senses. On the other, hedonism camouflaged as modern life, more comfort, more pleasure, more success, but always more. Neither suits the common human being. The ascetic denies the will, and few have the strength for that. The life addict, on the other hand, never questions the absurdity of his own demands. And that is why Schopenhauer wrote 50 rules for living well. Not for saints or libertines, but for common people who suffer. People who have already realized they are exhausted, but do not know of what else. The goal of life is not happiness, but the reduction of suffering, wrote Schopenhauer. This simple and brutal sentence brings an almost medical principle. If there is no cure, treat the pain. And when it comes to the human experience, this means recognizing that it is not pleasure that sustains us, but the absence of constant suffering. Mass culture, social media, advertising, self-help pushes us precisely toward the opposite, an ideal of life where every moment should be exciting, memorable, satisfying. That idea makes us sick. According to the World Health Organization, the number of people with anxiety and depression in the world increased by more than 25% in just 1 year during the pandemic. But what this statistic reveals is not just an effect of isolation, it is the explosion of an old malaise. The constant expectation that life should be good all the time. Schopenhauer knew this before any psychologist. For him, practical wisdom consisted of something almost outrageously simple. Prefer serenity to euphoria, quiet sleep to adrenaline, modest health to sick luxury. And this choice requires a complete realignment of personal values. Instead of asking, what will make me happiest, we must ask, what will cost me the least pain? This is what he calls eudaimonia, not in the Stoic sense of heroic virtue, but as a bearable human condition. A life where, when weighing losses and gains, existence still seems preferable to nothingness. It is not triumphant. It is lucid. And only that lucidity can move us away from the eternal trap of just a little more. All possession is potential pain because it can be lost. At this point, modern life reveals itself to be tragically comedic. We buy what we do not need with money we do not have, to impress people who do not care. And when anxiety arrives, we take pills to silence the scream that the will insists on emitting. But there is another way, neither radicalism, nor denial, nor total surrender. Schopenhauer offers the realistic middle path. Accept that life is made up of inevitable discomforts, and that the game is not in defeating them, but in organizing yourself so that they hurt as little as possible. Avoid excess, avoid expectations, avoid vices disguised as ambition. It is not about being mediocre, but about being honest with one's own nature, knowing how far it is worth going and where the price of going further begins, because sometimes the true luxury is not needing anything else. When the body falls ill, everything else disappears. No luxury compensates for chronic pain. No affection compensates for lack of sleep. No victory is worth a mind in ruins. The first forgotten truth of existence is this: the foundation of the good life is not in what is conquered, but in what is not lost. Schopenhauer does not doubt, health outweighs all external goods. A healthy beggar is happier than a sick king. It is not a metaphor, it is a rigorous philosophical judgment, because the quality of life is not in the circumstances, but in the internal experience. And that experience is determined, first and foremost, by the state of the body and mind. However, we live as if this were negotiable. We exchange sleep for goals, tranquility for urgency, routine for stimulation. And when we get sick, we act as if it were an accident and not the mathematical consequence of systematic choices against ourselves. The truth, as Schopenhauer reveals, is that most of our pains are self-inflicted, not out of malice, but out of ignorance of what truly matters. We were taught to value prestige, influence, speed, accumulation, but in silence. The human soul screams for three increasingly rare things: health, solitude, simplicity. Health gives us sovereignty over the body. Solitude, space to exist without performance. Simplicity, freedom from dependence on excess. These are riches so obvious that almost no one pursues them until they lose them. What a man is inwardly matters 1,000 times more than what he has, wrote the pessimistic master Schopenhauer. That is why the philosopher exalts the value of what does not shine. A day without pain, a silent afternoon, a mind at peace with its own thoughts. These are the invisible goods that sustain life stably, unlike possessions, which are always accompanied by the anxiety of losing them. The modern world, however, has inverted the equation. Status is more valued than sleep, constant connection is more desired than introspection, artificial abundance is more celebrated than the lightness of an austere life. But this inversion comes at a cost. The inability to be alone generates unhealthy relationships. The contempt for simplicity generates debt, burnout, exhaustion. The denial of the body as a foundation generates avoidable physical and mental illnesses. Schopenhauer does not offer a miracle cure, but he offers a lucidity that does not age. If you want to suffer less, protect what is impossible to buy. Cultivate your health like a fragile garden. Preserve solitude as one defends a sacred territory. Embrace simplicity as one recognizes the trap of excess. None of this demands a grand philosophy of life. It only requires understanding, as he wrote, that the measure of happiness is not in the presence of pleasure, but in the absence of suffering. That is the firm ground where a bearable life can be built. Everything above that is luxury. Everything below, torture. Maturity does not bring comfort, it brings clarity. Clarity about everything that was excess, about everything that never arrived despite the waiting, and about what remained almost always, what youth despised: silence, limits, peace. Youth is a violence against reality. It wants more than life can give, faster than it allows. But old age has another energy, colder, more austere, wiser. Because only after so many failed attempts does the human being understand. It is not the world that frustrates, it is the desire that demands too much. By now, Schopenhauer's logic has fully imposed itself. There is no longer any way to defend the thesis of happiness as a right. There is no longer any way to believe that pleasure sustains. There is no longer any way to ignore that. Everything of value is born from the reduction of harm, from the containment of wanting, from liberation regarding what always seemed indispensable. The will, that blind impulse that moves us from birth, has pushed us enough. Now, the body hurts, the mind gets tired, and time shows that there are no more promises to fulfill. This is not a defeat. It is an opportunity. The rare opportunity to become disillusioned without collapsing. Life, when viewed closely, is a tragedy, but when viewed from a distance, it is a comedy, wrote Arthur Schopenhauer. This phrase, read quickly, seems like irony, but it is not. It is condensed wisdom, because as time goes by, suffering ceases to be a tragic exception and becomes the comic structure of the absurdity of existence. Everything we took too seriously is revealed to be ridiculous. Everything we desired with fury is shown to be irrelevant. And everything we ignored, the body, the spirit, solitude, is shown to be essential. The dignity of one who stopped running, not because they arrived, but because they understood that there was no arrival. And if there is any real freedom, it is that. To stop lying to oneself about what life can give. In the end, 3 conscious movements remain. Reduce the wanting, protect the essential, and suffer as little as possible. This does not transform life into a party, but it can transform it into something bearable and even, in some rare moments, into something silently good. By this point, happiness no longer matters. What matters is not breaking. What matters is not getting lost within the pain that the world offers freely. And with that hardened, yet lucid, gaze, Schopenhauer delivers his final lesson. The happiest man is he who has lived most quietly, not he who has experienced the most pleasures. The final truth remains, dry, unadorned, but undeniable. You do not defeat the pain of life with strength, but with lucidity. And whoever understood this, even late, is already one step ahead of everything else. If you believe that this view of the world should continue, that these reflections deserve space, becoming a member is the most direct way to keep this project alive. Besides supporting, you receive extra content, get early access to videos, and participate in a community that does not shy away from difficult truths. To those who are already members, you are not just sponsors. You are the backbone of this journey. Thank you for being here, for sustaining this search with lucidity and courage. But no, watching, commenting, and sharing is already a lot. This only makes sense because you are there on the other side, searching, feeling, thinking deeply in a world that increasingly avoids thinking. This channel is not just mine, it is ours, and it remains alive because people like you still exist.